listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I am here with my co-host, Bob Schlehuber. Let's get ready to go against the grain. We have another great show for you today. We'll start off the hour discussing the new aggravating trend of resistance distraction over actual tangible resistance that liberals seem to revel in these days. Later, we'll get into the fascinating discussion on the media's philosophical responsibility of being the public's guard dog and the discrediting of the U.S. media for not living up to that particular obligation. The latest iteration is the new firestorm on the credibility of Ronan Farrow's reporting in his book Catch and Kill, and the lack of skepticism Farrow was met with as he dropped one salacious story after the next during his media enticement blitz. In similar terms, the media's fiscal incentives around the Trump and Russia conspiracy, we have another situation where the financial imperatives of mainstream media obliviates decent reporting. Later, we'll get into the strange revelations involving Norma McCorvey, the woman known as Jane Roe in the landmark Supreme Court case Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion. Norma admitted that she was lying when she switched support to anti-abortion movement, basically saying she was bribed to do so. That is mind-blowing, considering the implications of Roe v. Wade. In the second hour, we'll shake things up a bit, but we'll keep the momentum going with Schlehuber and Thomas Question Time. This may end up being a segment unto itself, but this is going to be a lot of fun, so you definitely don't want to miss this. We'll delve into questions and venture at answers on our united national interests and expectations in our surreal current circumstance of the COVID pandemic. Also, today is Wednesday. That means Revelations. We have a bizarre and interesting one for you today based on recent research into alternate universe where time runs backwards. Seriously. The thing about physics is time, when we were talking about time in physics equations, doesn't necessarily have any bias towards front or back. And one of the main questions in physics is, why does time run forward? Or for that matter, why doesn't it run backwards? For all intents and purposes, the physics experiment will respond the same regardless of the direction of time. Well, they've just found evidence that there may be an alternate universe where time runs backwards. This is going to be fascinating. But let's start here. I don't know about you. You're watching this channel, so I would assume that it's probably also true to you. But I personally am tired of spectacle resistance. We're in a circumstance where we need real leadership with a focus on resolving material needs of the population in the midst of a crisis. Instead, we get liberal spectacle resistance. Whether it's Sanders and its dedication to a platform and a bundle of task forces to simultaneously save face and con lefties in the back of the party with any real legitimate concessions, or whether it's Elizabeth Warren, who still gets credit from liberals as being a lefty, despite her role in undermining the left in the 2020 primary, or for that matter, her current endorsement of Jerry Nadler in New York's 10th district over the lefty in the race, Lindsey Boland. Remember back during the fight over the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, when the narrative around Warren as a lefty was being created. During an interview with Huffington Post, Warren said, "My first choice is a strong Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. My second choice is no agency at all and plenty of blood and teeth on the floor." Oh, I love that line. Whatever I think about Warren, that is one of the greatest lines in politics. How drastically things have changed. Now we're inundated with resistant fighter Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House. A couple of days ago, we learned that Trump was taking daily doses of hydroxychloroquine to protect against COVID-19, as he's had several people in his administration that came down with the virus. Now, Pelosi, when asked about this, made a joke about Trump being quote-unquote morbidly obese and that this is not necessarily in his best interest. Now, this, of course, set the Twitterverse and the hashtag resistance fighters everywhere aflame. Yes, Nancy Pelosi! This is awesome. And yet, not so much. I mean, basically, resistance fighter just set everyone aflame. To be clear, More than 33 million people have lost their jobs. 42% of those jobs aren't coming back. More than 30 million people lost their health care during this particular healthcare crisis. We've been watching the indignity of breadlines in the richest country on the planet, including in Nancy Pelosi's own state. Even before the pandemic, under Democratic and Republican administrations, 44% of the public was making under $18,000 a year. Put that in perspective. 44% of the population was making under $18,000 a year. The majority of this country lives paycheck to paycheck without $500 in the bank in case of an emergency, many of which have zero in the bank. Well, we're in the middle of a healthcare crisis. We're in the middle of an emergency. We're in the middle of an economic crisis. The Speaker of the House that passed every bill that Trump and the Republicans pushed out regarding this quote-unquote stimulus, that were basically giveaways, eventually herself was pushed out a bill that had no chance of success in regards to passing. And despite the fact that it had no chance of success regarding the passing, she would not back a policy of Medicare for all that says 88% Democratic approval. They would not back elimination of student debt, which has over 70% Democratic approval. And even with this notion of continued checks that went to people directly to ensure that those people had the ends that they needed to make for an economy that has basically and literally hit the skids, you couldn't get Nancy Pelosi to do it. What you could get Nancy Pelosi to do is make a fat joke about Donald Trump being morbidly obese. That fat joke was immortalized on Twitter with various hashtags. Morbidly obese, hashtag morbidly obese, hashtag Trump morbidly obese, obesity, Trump. These hashtags, Nancy Pelosi, as if this was the best and the strength of her resistance, missing the fact that Nancy Pelosi is literally Speaker of the House. And Nancy Pelosi had the ability to create policy in order to push back against the 4 Republican stimulus plans that she just didn't do. That is important to understand, and why my angst and aggravation about this. There's a reality to politics. There's a reality to politics where you use crisis like this in order to get your political agenda accomplished. Look at what Trump is doing. Right now, Trump has put through an executive order that used all powers at his disposal to basically open up this economy. What this will end up doing is getting Republican priorities accomplished under the guidelines of the COVID-19 pandemic. This was no different than FDR getting his own priorities accomplished during the Great Depression. What did FDR do? FDR came in and enacted legislation as if the United States was under assault by a foreign invaded army. That's what you expect, right? Especially from the standpoint of the party that is supposed to represent the left. Let's be very clear. A hashtag calling the president morbidly obese does nothing to deal with the crisis that's at hand and the people who've lost their jobs and the people that are ill. We have over 90,000 people that have lost their life, 1.5 million that are dead, that are infected. The constituency that in large part supports the Democratic Party to the tune of 90% is disproportionately affected, both in the context of health, but also in the context of economic despair. This is not resistance. I understand that you may get a kick out of it, but consider for the moment that if you consider this to be resistance, if you consider such minute, infantile pushback attacks on the president from the standpoint of this kind of verbal jousting, when Pelosi is literally in a position of power where she is running the House and she has the capability and ability to push forth legislation to push back against Republican ideas and to come to some level of piecemeal where she gets real concessions in order to get that stuff. That's not what she did. This is not resistance. This is just infantile attacks on the president. And you need to really have an honest conversation with yourself if indeed you consider calling somebody fat or morbidly obese resistance. If Donald Trump came out and said Stacey Abrams was morbidly obese, I don't think any of you would consider that resistance. You'd consider that just mean-spirited. But because it's Trump, it's fair game. It is funny using the term morbid, but I'm asking something a little bit deeper than this. Do you want your opposition leaders, who's supposed to be pushing back against a man who's supposedly the apocalypse, to do more than just verbal jousting or just giving a weird handshake during the speech? Do you want that party and that person to actually represent your interests in putting out the ideas and the things that you believe are necessary for this population? Be it Medicare for all, be it elimination of student debt, be it $15 minimum wage. These are things that the American public, especially the Democratic Party, agrees with en masse, almost in unanimity. And yet, what they consider pushback is calling the president fat. Bob, this is not resistance. This is just spectacle. This is wine and circus that gets liberals a Twitter, when the reality of it is Nancy Pelosi has passed those defense bills. She's passed every last one of these stimulus bills, and she wouldn't even put lefty priorities that get 88% support in her bill as opposed to giving that money to lobbyists and health insurance companies.
Yeah, I mean, the other moment that I remember is when she was questioned or not about whether she prayed for Donald Trump or not, and she lost her mind. How dare somebody challenge her Catholic deep-seated beliefs, and she flipped out. And you're saying where's that same energy when it comes to policy and getting bills passed through the House of Representatives? So much of the resistance movement has been about respectability politics here in the United States. It always comes down to bipartisanship, the better angels of our nature working across the aisle. And so even this moment where you're hoping there would be some resistance, at the end of the day, each of these Democratic politicians want to talk about bipartisanship and triangulation is because they care more about the center and the right to win than they do about the left. And so everything at the end of the day comes back to with power sharing with the Republicans or bipartisanship around the economy and capitalism moving forward. And you're totally right. The resistance heroes, one was Barack Obama, who we're finding out more and more about every day, played a major role in unmasking conversations between Michael Flynn and the Russian diplomat Kislyak. And you're seeing that after he basically told James Comey, the sitting FBI director, don't give all of the information on Russia to Donald Trump because they might be in deep collusion. And if you need me, by the way, I'll be with Richard Branson wind sailing on vacation. And you're saying to yourself, if it's that serious, if the country's about to be cooed by Vladimir Putin, maybe you don't take the vacation right away, Barack Obama, and stay a little bit closer to the shores. And then you have somebody like Adam Schiff, Jamal, who is the poster child, the poster boy for the Democratic Party at the House Intelligence Committee, leading the way in the Russiagate narrative and all of the impeachment hearings. While he all that Trump, he's voting to continue to push forward the FISA courts and domestic spying of U.S. citizens, giving the president Donald Trump more power. So what kind of difference is if you're continuing to vote for power that extended to the president more and the resistance here is everybody how great they are. It's quite a
Jamal, take up.
Yeah, so Bob, I entirely agree with you on this. It is kind of weird, but let's do this. Let's take a break, and let's come back, and we're going to have the first segment of the show. Welcome back. Welcome to Political Misfits. Let's take an outro, and we'll be back shortly.
Sorry. So Bob.
Or at 102.9 and 104.7 in Kansas City.
Hi, this is Max Kaiser and host Stacey Herbert, and we're doubling down.
Yeah, we're doubling down on crazy. We're doubling down on our new show called Double Down on Sputnik. It's doubling down on absolute joyous radio nirvana. You will love it. You will want to listen to every single episode on Sputnik. Bye, y'all.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, the show that goes against the grain. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm here with my co-host, Bob Schlehuber. Thank you guys for joining us. If you guys are digging this content, like and share. We're also trying to grow the show, and your engagement is always appreciated in that process. You can reach us at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. So, over the weekend, a Bombshell Takedown piece was released by the New York Times' Ben Smith, poking holes in the work of author and journalist Ronan Farrow. Now, Farrow's recent book, Catch and Kill, gained huge notoriety over Ronan's reporting. He was instrumental in exposing apex pervert Harvey Weinstein and his years of abusive behavior. But a close second to the exposure of Harvey Weinstein had to do with a rape accusation against Matt Lauer at the Sochi Olympics that basically ended Matt Lauer. The takedown piece in the New York Times was joined by a Mediate article from none other than Matt Lauer himself, stressing both his innocence of the accusation, but also expressing consternation at Farrow's work not being critically engaged with journalistic standards of cooperation, evidence, and rigorous disclosure. Now, whatever you want to think of Lauer, Ben Smith and Lauer do have a point. The Gulf of Tonkin didn't happen. There were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. The last chemical attacks by Syria either didn't happen, or substantial evidence that it came from terrorist networks, despite the fact that media not covering this. And of course, the opus of failure, Russiagate. To discuss media's responsibility and the failure to live up to that responsibility, we're joined by our colleague at Radio Sputnik, Dr. Wilmer Leon, a political scientist and host of the Critical Hour. Dr. Leon, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, as always, thank you for the invitation. Good afternoon to you and to the audience.
Good afternoon.
Yeah, so to be clear, Farrow and his publisher pushed back strongly against the Time reporting and stood by the integrity of his work. I just wanted to put that out there just so you have the contrary story. Dr. Leon, I think the thing that intrigued me about this was the way monetized reality incentivizes some stories over others and makes rigorous journalistic standards expensive, not just monetarily, but also politically. Ben Smith, in his New York Times piece, said something that I would like you to respond to, Dr. Leon. So, quote, his reporting can be misleading, but it does not make things up. His work, though, reveals the weakness of a kind of resistance journalism that has thrived in the age of President Donald Trump. That if reporters swim ably along with the tides of social media and produce damaging reporting about public figures most disliked by the loudest voices, the old rule of fairness and open-mindedness can seem more like impediments than essential journalistic imperatives. God, I love that statement. Dr. Leon, can you respond to that?
Well, it's interesting that you highlighted that because that jumped out as me as well. In fact, if you go back just one more sentence, Mr. Farrow 32 is not a fabulist, meaning he doesn't make stuff up, but his reporting can be misleading. I wondered what was the real motivation behind this New York Times piece, and if it was really laying the groundwork for an attack on investigative journalism, and using this whole thing with Farrow kind of as the talking horse to do so. And the in making reference to resistance journalism, I had to look that up because I didn't know if there was a clear working definition of resistance journalism. I'm not a journalist. I've never claimed to be. I tell people all the time, I'm a political scientist with a talk show. I don't have a degree in journalism. I got a degree in political science. So I had to look up resistance journalism. I couldn't find out a true working definition of one. So my response to this is, I wonder, that paragraph made me wonder what is in fact real motivation behind the New York Times publishing this whole thing, starting this whole row, and if it was really an attack on investigative journalism.
Interesting. So you think this is an attack on Ronan Farrow's investigative journalism. But is there something to be said there about, I guess you could say, rigorousness in regards to reporting? I mean, does the author have a point? I guess that's what I'm asking, right? I mean, is there something to be said about monetized reality and the incentives that go into monetized reality that provoke or push Ronan to do a story like this, or for that matter, the Russiagate narrative, where these guys just ran with it kind of like a bag in the wind without taking a contrary perspective or even a potential contrary perspective in this case? What do you think is the root of that? What is the thing that pushes reporters and journalists to do that? Because I agree with you that, why are they doing this now? But I do think, but there is a point, or there is something to what he's saying here, correct?
there is a point to what he's saying. There's no question, and particularly when you start using the word monetized. But what I found very interesting in this was the word propaganda was not used. Because when you start talking about the Russiagate narrative, that's not resistance journalism, that's propaganda. When you start talking about WMDs and using that narrative as a rationale for taking a country into war and threatening the world, that's not monetized journalism, that's propaganda. And so we then have to go back Bernays, who's considered to be the father of public relations and propaganda. He's the guy that helped Woodrow Wilson promote the idea that the U.S. efforts in World War I were actually intended to bring democracy to Europe.
That's right.
He's the one that came up with the whole idea of using the media to shape public opinion and public mind. So it's one thing to swim ably along with the tides of social media. That's okay, but that has nothing to do, that doesn't mean that you lie. That doesn't mean that you fail to check your sources. That doesn't mean that you create conspiracies and narratives that cannot be verified. In my mind, there's a difference between that and propaganda. And unfortunately, what we've seen from far too much in mainstream American media, whether it be the New York Times, whether it be the Washington Post, whether it be MSNBC, is propaganda.
Yeah, Dr. Leon, thank you again for joining us, and welcome to Political Misfits here. We'd love to hear any of our listeners' thoughts on this conversation. You give us call at 202-521-1320. Yeah, I think you're totally right on the usage of propaganda, and that's what we've seen with the Russiagate stuff, right? And in that book, Propaganda, that you're referencing, I always remember the conversation around how to sell people pianos, I think. And what he was saying, Burnby was saying, was you don't sell people a piano, you sell them the idea of having a large living room for gatherings and let people get to the natural conclusion that, man, it would be great to have a piano in here. So then they felt like they were the one coming up with the idea. And with the Russiagate stuff, I think it was American interest to continue to push aggressive geopolitics and a war posture at the Russian government. And so instead of actually coming out and saying that to the American people, instead what we come up with is, oh, the Russians are meddling with us. They're coming and ruining our democracy. And what the hope is, I think, is then that American people would say, wait, we shouldn't be meddled with. Let's go fight those people. And giving the American people this kind of false notion that they're the ones that came up with having an aggressive foreign policy at the Russians and leading them down that path. And it is a tool used by media outlets. So going back to this investigative journalism, though, or resistance journalism, I mean, so much of it is, for me, what happened after 2016, I guess when 2017, when Trump gets into office. You have all of these people that weren't very politically engaged coming out of the restaurants, out of their brunch breaks, to come out in the streets and have like resistance activism, resistance politics, and then followed it was resistance journalism, whatever that means. And a lot of these late night talk shows, and that's where it irks me the most, is all of these late night talk shows hosts that just simply made fun of Donald Trump every single day, as if that was somehow the goal of comedy, was just to make fun of somebody, as opposed to get into deeper lampooning of these people, into satire and skepticism and cynicism, to be able to reveal truths about where our politics could go. And so it seems like both the whole entire media landscape has been completely wrecked by this kind of resistance journalism over the last 4 years. And we're in a really scary place in my mind. And as a political scientist, I'm interested in your thoughts on it, of without a media that is actually able to be critical, and all it is able to do right now is just kind of be reactionary, where does that leave the American populace and our ability to understand what's happening in our political spheres?
Well, that's a great question. I think to a great degree, it leaves us where, unfortunately, we have been for at least 40 or 50 years. And that is, if your only sources are mainstream American media, you are really, really stuck. You are really stuck with narratives and with constructs that the U.S. government wants you to understand, and they use the New York Times, they use the Washington Post, they use MSNBC and others to further those ideas. You really have to go, and this is why this jumped out at me. We now have to go to independent sources of media. And whether you want to call them resistance journalists or investigative reporters, so that's where the Max Blumenthals come into the picture. That's where the Greg Palast come into the picture. That's where the Gray Zone and Mint Press and so many other independent websites come into play and are providing clearer narratives on the motivations and bases of a lot of the stories that we're reading.
Yeah, and I guess a quick follow-up is just the lack of accountability for any of these journalists is also extremely concerning for me. I mean, you can publish lie after lie and you can bury retractions the next day deep into your paper, but none of these people are ever held accountable, and I just find myself banging my head against the wall when I have to argue with somebody why like MSNBC or CNN or the Post or the New York Times are not credible news outlets, and there's no one out there basically saying, and I guess maybe your point is there are a few of the gray zones of the world, the Matt Taibbi's and Rolling Stone or the Greg Palast that are trying to hold these people accountable, but we're also in a place where basically there's no accountability for journalism.
I would agree. And a perfect example of that, and I hate to keep picking on MSNBC, but how does a guy like Brian Williams still come into my living room every evening at midnight if I choose to turn on the TV set?
Yes.
How does a guy who's supposed to be a journalist, who was the face of NBC News, who then is found to be nothing but a liar, wind up back on the same darn network? How does that happen? This is Rachel Maddow, who time after time has been proven to be wrong. I'm still waiting for them to lead the president out of the White House with handcuffs. She's the one that told me that was going to happen. I'm still waiting, Rachel, and it hasn't happened yet. But they're there every night. They're there telling you. And so the interesting thing about one of the interesting things about the Russiagate story, which I think makes it kind of unique, is it served both sides of the aisle. It served Hillary Clinton as a distraction from people actually reading and understanding the content of a lot of the emails that were released. And then it serves the Republican side, which is also, in this instance, the Democratic side, in that gives the United States boogeyman they've been looking for since it revitalizes the red baiting and the Russian as the enemy narrative. Well, that one story serves both sides of the argument.
Yeah, and it ultimately just serves one group of people, which is often the elites that have so much stake in the current status quo. And I think the ultimate takeaway with the Russiagate stuff is those who make a lot of money off of weapons or off of neoconservative foreign policy continue to have the prevailing winds at their back when it comes to pushing xenophobia and anti-Russian sentiment here in the country. And the same thing with the Me Too coverage. At the end of the day, you know what? We know the Harvey Weinsteins of the world. We know the Matt Lauers of the world, the Louis C.K.'s of the world. But the problem with power dynamics, sexual assault, misogyny, all of those issues still prevail within our societies. And so it's great that we called out and maybe held a few people accountable. But ultimately, again, journalism basically looks at the flashpoints, the top headline news, the salacious, sexy scandal, clickbaity kind of news, and we never actually get underneath these problems to get to the root causes. And at least I think that's what media should be. But correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Leon.
No, I think providing, if not providing the solution, at least providing the ammunition for the conversation to develop. So if we look at it from a foreign policy context, all of this discussion about Venezuela, all of this discussion about Bolivia and Brazil, Nicaragua, and all of that is basically providing rationale for U.S. interventionism in the politics of these countries, while at the same time, the United States is crying foul over alleged Russian interference in our politics. I don't see the New York Times equating those two. I don't see the New York Times saying, okay, we're complaining about alleged Russian hacking, but we're also behind this coup in Venezuela, and I don't know that that's really consistent.
Consistency has nothing to do with that, Dr. Leon. I mean, for example, the United States, many congressmen came out and said that a hack that they had no proof that had taken place was equivalent to 9/11 or Pearl Harbor. They then turned around and would basically be okay with trying to topple Venezuela, working with, Guaido, who basically didn't win a pie contest, but they're trying to call that man president of the United States, but they don't see the disparity. Or, for that matter, Obama. The New York Times will run a story talking about Obama spending like $1 billion, got 500,000 people killed to try to topple the government of Syria. But they don't see the disparity and the hypocrisy between, oh my God, a hack is equivalent to 9/11, but our president was involved in toppling Libya and Syria that got hundreds of thousands of people dead. President of Venezuela, Guaido, that's what they call him anyway. But you get my point. The hypocrisy is just endemic. I mean, I'm curious, what has social media done to this? Meaning, what effect has social media had on the way that reporting takes place in regards to mainstream media? Or is this a consequence of pressure on media in order to sell their papers at a time of social media?
I think social media has played a number of roles in what we're talking about. And one of the primary roles that I see social media playing is social media drives, in many regards, the interest in and controls the direction that the focus of the story. What do I mean by that? A lot of talk show hosts and a lot of journalists look to social media, see what's trending on social media, and they use that as their guidepost in order for what to focus on and what to write about. Instead of they're doing their own research, understanding what's really going on in the world and reporting on that. And to me, that's one of the beauties of what we do here at Radio Sputnik. We don't sit here and look at social media and talk about what's trending. We've been charged with looking across the world and understanding what's not being reported or what's not being reported accurately and trying to shed light on those stories. There are enough I get invited to where I find that the topics that they're discussing are just what's simply trending on social media.
Yeah, we continue to be joined by Dr. Wilmer Leon, the host of the Critical Hour here on Radio Sputnik Daily at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So don't turn the dial if you're listening to us on 105.5 FM here in the nation's capital or wherever you may be listening to the show. Make sure to check out his program daily. Jamal, I think it was a great question you asked there. It's really the kind of consolidation of these larger powers that I think is going to be the story over the next year or two when it comes to who owns the media. Obviously, a billionaire now owns the LA Times. You're seeing Jeff Bezos and Amazon buy the Washington Post. You're seeing Facebook try to buy up as many different media outlets as they can and basically offer Facebook news with different stories collected from across the internet. You see Apple looking to basically charge people on their phones to go through their news service to have different access. You can basically buy a pass to all of these different outlets just through Apple. And so we're seeing a conglomeration between these big tech and multi-billionaires and millionaires buying up news outlets. And this kind of goes back to, like, once you have all the money in the world, what do you do next? And it seems like you try to buy up power and control through the media.
Well, that leads to a good question, Bob. I mean, it's implicit in that comment is basically the question of, is media that lucrative? And Dr. Leon, this is a question for you. Is media that lucrative, or are there other reasons that you have millionaires, billionaires, or for that matter, these corporations buying up media outlets?
Jamal, to that question and to Bob's point, the answer to your question is no. Media is not lucrative. Some of it depends on how you define lucrative.
Right.
If you're talking about lucrative in terms of profitable, no. And that's why we know, starting, I want to say around the mid-'70s, it might have been a little later, that hard newsrooms and news programs started trending more towards, what's the term, lifestyle and entertainment. because news gathering is expensive. Having bureaus around the world and all of that kind of stuff, that costs money. And so news, as I understand, again, I'm not a journalist, so don't scream at me if I'm off here, but newsrooms are expensive and tended to be not profitable, and it was the other elements of a network that were offsetting the losses from news programs. When they then started shifting to lifestyle and entertainment, that's when they started to become profitable, but that's also when they started to lose their journalistic focus.
Wait, that's a good point. How did this evolve? I mean, because you're right. How did this system, where media is behaving in the way that it's behaving now, evolve? I mean, because you're right. At some point, media wasn't supposed to be a profitable enterprise, but at some point, it did become this notion of a profit-making enterprise. Meaning, when MSNBC or when CNN has the presidential debates, and they treat it like a boxing match, as opposed to an actual debate. That's them trying to get you interested in these kind of quick soundbite ways where they want to keep your attention span and make it look like this kind of competitive type thing as opposed to a political back and forth. How did that evolve?
I think it evolved over through profit motive. I think it also evolved through Americans. From what I've always read, we're the least read literate country in the world. We have some of the shortest attention spans, and so people can't focus and don't read. So they're trying to find the way to keep the debate entertaining, not really informative, but entertaining, and subscribe to the least common denominator of the American electorate. When you turn off the debate, rarely do you walk away from it having a clearer understanding of where a particular candidate stands on policy. Rarely do you have that understanding. All you know is who you like better, who came up with the cutest quip or the cleverest line, and then that kind of carries the story for the next day or two.
So one more question on this. With all of the pressures that are on mainstream media right now, on paper and print media, because print media is the thing, the New York Times, for whatever issues we have with either the New York Times or Washington Post, the Washington Post was able to do the Afghan files, which was an extremely good piece of reporting going back over time in regards to our failures in Afghanistan and significant failures in the lies that was associated with it. Well, that's investigative reporting. It was actually good investigative reporting, even if it was something where, there was an axe to grind in regards to D.C. because the Washington Post or Jeff Bezos didn't get a contract that he wanted. It was still good reporting. Same thing with the New York Times going back to the United States war crimes in regards to Syria, in regards to Libya, and the billions of dollars spent, or in regards to us trying to topple the various governments in South America in order to maintain control over that particular region and the resources of those governments. So that reporting is entirely necessary. But are we looking at an end to that type of investigative reporting with the pressure that is on basically print media at this point?
I don't think we're looking at an end of it, because I would say those outlets that you mentioned, they're not totally vile, they're not totally corrupt. They do at times, a broken clock is correct twice a day. So they do still serve a purpose. There is value that comes from them. Unfortunately, it's just too few and far between. And the stories that you mentioned, there are a whole lot more of them that we should be hearing. For example, what's going on right now with the International Criminal Court, Israel, an investigation into the atrocities and the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. We're not hearing that through the wash. That should be front and center in the New York Times. There are interests at reporting on that to violate, and we're not hearing that as clearly as we should be. Because if we did, Americans would be totally outraged at how the United States is providing cover for those atrocities. So those outlets, they do perform a function, and the function can be valuable. Unfortunately, they just don't do enough of it. And I just want to quickly make a point about, you asked about the profitability of these. Why are these billionaires suing these outlets? And it's because they have value. It may not turn into dollars and cents from the newsroom itself, but getting back to Bernays, the ability to manipulate the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in a democratic society. That has a value, an intrinsic value in and of itself. They are being manipulated by the unseen mechanism of society, constitutes an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of the country. So by controlling the media, if I control your information, I can control your world.
Yeah, and Jamal, just to your point about how there can be some things within the media that are good while it happens. I mean, it's kind of the same as the federal government. Donald Trump is the president, which is completely absurd, and he's going to break a lot of things, but you still have 2 million people that work for the federal government. So, like, good things can happen within broken systems, but those things are going to be slow, painful, and not nearly as good as they could be. I mean, imagine if those Afghan papers came out 15 years ago in the beginning of this whole thing. Maybe we could have ended the war sooner than we haven't. I guess we still haven't ended the thing. So anyways, Jamal, I mean, it is quite a fascinating story, but we're out of time here with Dr. Wilmer Leon. Dr. Leon, I get the chance to promote your show, The Critical Hour Daily. Tell us a little bit more about the show and what you all focus on there.
Well, thanks, Bob. We're a 1 hour, The Critical Hour. We're a 1 hour daily news wrap-up show. We try to pick 4 or 5 important stories of the day and either report on something that has not gotten the attention the day that it should, or we try our best to provide clarity to a story that is dominating the dialogue for the day.
Fantastic. That was Dr. Wilmer Leon, the host of The Critical Hour here on Radio Sputnik. We'll take a quick break before coming back with more. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik live in D.C. We're back after this.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Shooting from the left.
We're taking no prisoners here.
Real opinions for real people.
So where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out,
We actually let them expand on their views.
what's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schlegelberg here, sort of, kind of with Jamarl Thomas. Continue to bring you brand new shows daily from 12 to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Big shout out to all of our radio engineers for keeping us live on air, bringing you daily shows here on 105.5 FM. You could be potentially watching us as well on the Progressive Soapbox. Shout out to all of you there. Make sure you like and comment on the page there to make sure more people see our show so we can grow our island of misfits. Jamarl Thomas, we continue our show today here with a piece brought to us by our producer, Michelle Whitty. Michelle wanted to address Donald Trump's latest executive order. Let me warn you, listeners, it sounds like Michelle is at her wit's end.
Uh-oh.
Michelle writes, Tomorrow. Michelle writes, obviously, we're embroiled in a terrible crisis at the moment, but thank goodness we have an administration in power right now that knows exactly who our enemy is and how to neutralize them. That's why President Trump is once more charging into the battle against red tape. Oh, wait a minute. We're in the middle of a pandemic, not an epic fight against regulation. Well, crap. I guess they don't know how to handle illness, but they sure as hell know how to slash those fetters holding business back from being great at, say, pollution or discrimination or hiding profits or the like. So to that end, Trump yesterday issued a very vague executive order calling on federal agencies to ferret out any pesky little rules that might, quote, inhibit economic recovery and permanently or temporarily revoke them. Agencies should address this economic emergency by rescinding, modifying, waiving, or providing exemptions from regulations and other requirements that might inhibit economic recovery, the order says in part. And then the agencies should consider whether any of these temporary suspensions or changes to the rules and enforcement activities should be made permanent. The Trump administration loves deregulation. The president even bragged about it as he announced this order yesterday. Let's have a listen here. Trump talking about his executive order.
Because with millions of Americans forced out of work by the virus, it's more important than ever to remove burdens that destroy American jobs. In a few minutes, I will sign an executive order instructing federal agencies to use any and all authority to waive, suspend, and eliminate unnecessary regulations that impede economic recovery. And we want to leave it that way.
So, of course, tomorrow they're going to use this pandemic as an excuse to give free rein to businesses, and now they're trying to make those changes stick. Quite alarming, to say the least.
Yeah, that's quite alarming. But I want to point something out, something that I pointed out in the monologue that is extremely important. When there are crises that are taking place, whether that's the Russian Revolution, whether that's what's going on in France in regards to the pandemic, or anywhere else for that matter, people who have strong beliefs, ideological beliefs, use whatever that particular crisis for their own political ends. So FDR can use the crisis of the Great Depression in order to get his political ends accomplished: Glass-Steagall, Social Security, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Prohibition, ending prohibition, workers' protections and unions, or for that matter, a federal work guarantee. Why? Because he realized there was a crisis, and I'm going to use this crisis to make this country better and accomplish my political ends, not to mention, quote-unquote, save capitalism. Well, you have a similar crisis now with a Republican in office, and that Republican is thinking in similar ways. How can I get my agenda accomplished, which basically deregulation, expansion of business, dumping money into corporations, and that is literally what they did. The house was on fire, and that's what they decided to do. There's no opposition to this at all.
Yeah, and ultimately, for me, it takes a big strike at the Chevron deference, which was a 1974 Supreme Court ruling that basically gave the government the right to argue with a corporation or a non-government entity if there was a dispute between a law or a regulation that's put forward, and the government had deference over Chevron in this situation. But now what's going to happen is if all of the rules in the government are really ambiguous of what it means to cut this red tape, deregulation, what rules are, it's going to allow corporations to run ramshack, and basically the government's not going to actually be able to argue that they actually had any point to any of the regulations they put forward. And if you erode this in a way, you have very little government oversight and accountability, Jamar, and these corporations will basically be able to do whatever they want. They'll be challenged in court. But if the government basically says, you know what, we're not really clear on anything we want, it's all open for interpretation, it allows these corporations to interpret EPA rules, for example, in whatever form or fashion they want. This is quite terrifying, to say the least. Jamal, I want to pivot here to a new poll that is out this week from OnePoll, which surveyed 2,000 adults towards the end of April. And I'd love to get your thought on some of the poll results, which ask people about healthcare, the economy, and Donald J. Trump's handling of the pandemic. It's going to irritate the hell out of you when it comes to Trump's handling of the pandemic. I'm going to warn you right now. But let's start with healthcare, because you referenced that earlier in the show.
Yeah, that's my
In the poll, they found that more than 3/4 of respondents agreed that now is the right time for the country to experiment with universal healthcare. Additionally, 76% of respondents feel that people who contract COVID-19 should be charged for their medical expenses. Shouldn't be charged for their medical expenses. So 76% said you should not be charged if you contract COVID-19 and the medical expenses. And I'll get this, Jamal, this is where you had referenced earlier. 74% of self-identified Republicans and 84% of self-identified Democrats agree that the country should institute such a system of public health care, universal health care, in response to the pandemic. 74% Republicans, 84% Democrats.
That's right, because it deals with their material needs. Like, think of for the moment, people think Republicans are unempathetic or they don't care about anybody but themselves. That is true, very true. John McCain didn't care. He was willing to bomb places that the military wasn't even involved or on board for bombing, but he cared about torture because he was tortured. Same thing with Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney cared greatly about his daughter. His daughter just so happened to be gay, so the whole idea of homosexuality, despite being a Republican, he didn't care. Well, in this very specific case, those Republicans are also getting ill. Those Republicans also have to pay health care bills. And those Republicans have probably said, my mom, my cousin, my uncle, this pertains directly to me and my health. Yeah, we need to do something about this. So I'm not shocked entirely by this at all. I mean, Medicare for All was getting 88% approval by Democrats and I think 40-something% of Republicans before this even hit. And so that number was only going to go up the moment that people's medical and healthcare needs was at point. Now, the catch becomes, does that translate into the public saying Medicare for all in general, not just Medicare for all for people with coronavirus? And I suspect that number may deviate from the standpoint of Republicans, but it may stay constant for independents and Democrats. But either way, that's a majority.
Yeah.
And the notion that Pelosi is pushing for COBRA is obscene. I mean, you have numbers like this, and she's pushing for COBRA payments as opposed to actually pushing for Medicare for all. This is my point. Republican Party, what are they doing? They're using this crisis as a moment to push for their political priorities and giving all of this money and all of these regulations away to corporations. Democrats and their priorities of Medicare for all, when they get the overwhelming majority of the public, including Republicans, on their side, the best that they can push for is COBRA.
Yeah, and that's why Bernie Sanders' whole point is like, my policies aren't radical. Stop calling me a radical when 74% of Republicans agree with this thing. How is this radical? Jamal, on the other healthcare costs, just to reference it here, 81% of people in the poll said that insurance companies should cover all COVID-19 related expenses. I'll be really curious as we move forward if there is a sacrificial lamb or two, if it's big pharma or if it's a big bank or two, or if it's some of these insurance companies. Eventually, you would just think somebody has to be thrown to the wolves to allow people to feel some type of political engagement, that their voice is actually heard. 81%. It'll be interesting to see if that hits anybody at all. Jamal, on the economy now of that poll, a whopping, and this is not surprising at all, a whopping 82% of people feel that the one-time stimulus check of $1,200 is not enough to cover expenses. Always fascinated to know who are those 18% of people that thought $1,200 would be enough. Other popular ideas in the poll, 55% believe that mortgage and rent payments should be frozen during this time. Another 63% say student loan companies should freeze interest rates and payments, and nearly 8 in 10 respondents agree that the Fed needs to do more to protect those who have become unemployed. Interestingly enough here, a number drops a little bit. 58% think those who have lost their jobs should receive more federal financial support. So kind of contradictory there. More people basically saying that $1,200 is not enough, not as many people saying the Fed should do more to financially support people. But it seems again here that the tide is turned against any inaction when it comes to the economy by the federal government.
How weird is that? I mean, like you would think that this would be common sense, right? And I mean, you're in the middle of a crisis. The government has become the buyer of last resort, or for that matter, is propping up capitalism in its entirety. I mean, the Fed is putting out trillions of dollars. The government is putting out trillions of dollars supporting businesses, corporations, and companies and workers at this point. I wish that this created something that goes forward where the public starts seeing themselves and responsibility of government in different ways. I'm curious, do you think that the public going forward would? Do you think this crisis, kind of like the Great Depression, where the public started getting a different perspective of the role and responsibility of government towards the individual, do you think that that's similar here, or that we've moved so far to the right that that perspective and that ability to kind of shift that over to the window is somewhat handicapped because we've moved so far to the right? Or do you think that, no, we can have a revitalization of the way that we look at our government and what's responsible, or the responsibility of that government to the population?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think people are more shaken and more engaged more than ever in politics in this moment because they're seeing the failure of government. I don't think the response, though, is like, let's refocus on how to build up the central government here in Washington, D.C. I'm a big decentralized neighborhood by neighborhood, kind of start local first, kind of a Republican idea in many ways, like start in my own neighborhood. Too bad the Republican Party has been completely co-opted by right-wing ideological religious zealots that I'm not able to kind of espouse this like local at home first. But people need to start building independent networks of the government, bring back the demos, and have conversations at the hyper-local level, Jamal. I think that would be the best thing coming out of this moment. To just simply focus in on electoral politics in Washington, D.C., that's never going to change, at least in the near future, in my opinion. Last numbers here, Jamal, just to irk you a little bit. 30% of those people polled in this poll thought President Trump was unprepared at the beginning of the pandemic. So pretty obvious that he was unprepared, but 62% people think that he has handled the crisis well overall, and 72% think it was a mistake for the president to scale down the global health, security, and biodefense section of the National Security Council. So it seems like people think he's handling the crisis well, don't love all of his moves, Jamal, but they haven't abandoned the president writ large.
How weird is that? I mean, for the most part, his popularity has been able to stay rather stable. And, the question becomes, how does that relate from the standpoint of the election? Because there seemed to be contradictory information. You would have Trump with like a 51 or 49 to 50% approval rating, which is around what Obama was. By the same token, he's losing in the polling for the standpoint of the presidential election, with Joe Biden just in his basement barely doing anything. And so it seems like it's contradictory, and so it's hard to know like what's entirely accurate. I guess both could be true.
I mean, like 70% of people think he was prepared, but then none of these, Donald Trump's clearly not for universal health care. Right. So that contradiction of like, wait, this policy you're overwhelmingly for, but yet you're still for the guy who's against the policy you really care about.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense.
Jamal, we'll talk more about that over the next hour. One last story just to slide in here. I wanted to briefly touch on the Bombshell story you alluded to at the beginning of the hour that came out yesterday that revealed Norma McCorvey, the anonymous plaintiff in the landmark 1973 Roe v. Wade case, had been paid by right-wing groups to come out against abortion in 1995, 22 years after the ruling. The LA Times writes, quote, "At the time, it was a stunning announcement and represented a huge symbolic victory for abortion opponents. Jane Roe had gone to the other side. For the remainder of her life, McCorvey worked to overturn the law that bore her name. But it turns out now, revealed in a soon-to-be-released documentary, that it was all a lie. McCorvey says in the documentary, filmed in the months before her death in 2017, that she only came out against abortion because she was paid by anti-abortion groups, including Operation Rescue. McCorvey, a.k.a. Jane Roe, says in the interview, quote, "I was the big fish. I think it was a mutual thing. I took their money, and they'd put me out in front of cameras and tell me what to say. That's what I would say. It was all an act. I did it well, too. I'm a good actress." And what she describes as a deathbed confession, a visibly alien McCorvey restates her support for reproductive rights in colorful terms. If a young woman wants to have an abortion, that's no skin off my butt. That's why they call it choice. Jamal, the documentary, a.k.a. Jane Roe, premieres Friday on FX. About a minute left here. Are you going to watch?
Probably not. I mean, look, when people make this argument about freedom, this is not freedom. I mean, basically, this woman, compelled by her needs, changed her political position in order to get cash, something that was, devastating to a lot of other people in our society as they use her for propaganda. Yes, I appreciate the deathbed confession, but no, I'm not watching this.
Yeah, it reminds me so much of the Emmett Till story where the woman came out after the fact and said, you know what, he didn't actually whistle at me, and basically led to the lynching of a young black boy. And then same in this story right here, this woman basically changed the course of history, gave a huge boost to the anti-abortion movement. Incredibly terrifying, the power of individuals to sway the national consciousness. Jamal, we are at the end of our first hour here, but do not worry, you misfits. We have a second hour of news, politics, and culture coming your way. In our second hour, we play a brand new COVID-19 inspired game called Question Teen. Get it? It's kind of like quarantine. Yeah, that's right. COVID-19 jokes abound. Get ready for that. And in the second hour, we reveal in our weekly revelation segment that an alternative universe may exist where time moves backwards. Get a hold of that one. All that and much more. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik live in DC. We're back after this.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schlaber here, kind of sort of with Jamarl Thomas. We kick off our second hour of news, politics, and culture with you here with a fun new game we're excited to play. Give us a call, 202-521-1320 if you want to get in on it. We'll also be talking about these mass floods in Michigan that have started yesterday that will continue throughout the evening tonight. Quite scary, to say the least. Tell us a little bit more about what you think about that or anything you've heard on our show today. You can tweet at us at Sputnik Misfits. Almost forgetting our handle there, Jamarl Thomas. A lot to cover here in the next hour. As I mentioned here, we start with our brand new game called Question Teen, where we let all of the questions you have wanted to ask but have kept stored away regarding COVID-19. Question Teen is brought to you by Quarantini, America's new favorite drink. Joining us for Question Teen is John Pfeffer, the author, actor, and director of Foreign Policy and Focus at the Institute for Policy Studies. John, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
John, you're one of the most prolific artists, actors, writers that I know. I had to bring something fun for you. You've written quite a bit over the last few months about COVID-19, covered a lot of ground. So if anybody was to play this game with us, I thought you would be the best contestant. So you have you and our good friend here, co-host Jamarl Thomas, playing along. John, let's start here with round one, history and pop culture. We've heard lots of comparisons to a range of historical moments to give the pandemic some context. We've heard 9/11, we've heard the 1918 pandemic, and of course, every depression and economic recession we've seen in history. John, I'm curious, we'll start with you here. What historical moment does today most readily compare to?
Well, let's go back even further. Let's go back to 430 BC. At that time, Athens, the great city-state of Athens, the democracy, well, limited democracy of Athens, was experiencing a plague as well. It was in the middle of, at the beginning of a new war with its rival Sparta. Terrible plague had descended upon the city. And interestingly enough, at roughly the same time, one of the great classics of theater was being premiered, and that was Oedipus Rex. And Oedipus Rex, if remember, is of course about a guy who mistakenly and marries his mother. But at the beginning of that play, it also takes place during a plague. And so here you have a situation in which people in a plague city are watching the production of about a plague and trying to understand why the plague was hitting them. It has lots of resonances to today. I like comparing this to Trump. And of course, we have a democracy that is besieged and also, it seems, in an endless war. And so we can go back to Athens at 430 to try to understand the peculiar situation that we find ourselves in.
All right, Jamarl Thomas, what historical moment do you have going right now? And I'm mentioning here, I'm going to keep score of which answer I think is best. I'll reveal my count at the end of the game. Jamarl Thomas, what historical moment are you thinking the most about as we go through this global pandemic in 2020?
Interesting. So I guess if I had to think about this, I'm thinking about this in terms of calamity, like this inability for the government itself to deal with the crisis and the problems at hand for their own corporate or financial interests. I would say Rome. I mean, I make this catch of fiddling while Rome burns, and I think that's probably one of the best examples. You basically have a government that was able to be masters of the world. Our own government is modeled a lot in regards to Rome. And in the same way that Rome basically collapsed from the inside, we are doing the exact same thing. So I will choose Rome.
All right. I'm going to put out there the Gilded Age, the late 1870s to 1900, as we're heading more to austerity and the stealing of our public money and consolidation. So that'll be my answer for now. John Pfeffer, the second question we have here in our game: what book, play, movie, or piece of art most speaks to the current COVID-19 pandemic? Obviously, I'm gonna discount Contagion and Outbreak; those had plenty of news coverage as everybody rushed to Netflix over the first month or two of the stay-at-home orders. What pieces of art are you referencing the most here, John Pfeffer?
I guess I'd go for The Decameron by Boccaccio, and was basically a collection of 100 stories that tell each other, and they tell each other they are sheltering in place outside of Florence, somewhere in the maybe the 15th century, I think, possibly the 13th century. I forget when they're doing this, but the dynamic is an interesting one because you have very privileged people who are able to shelter in place and tell themselves amusing stories. And meanwhile, the plague is just tearing through Florence and of course tearing through the communities of essential workers who don't have the leisure to sit around and tell each other stories.
All right. Well, John Pfeffer looking to out-intellect all of us.
Yeah, I can't beat that one. I can't beat that at all. Go over. Ask the question again, Bob. Let me try it again. Yeah, that's a tough one. Shelter in place. Oh, God. Yeah, he's out-intellecting us on this one. I guess my first thought is, my thing is military history. And my thought went to the soldiers that were in the various military organizations where they were stuck in regards to bunkers, like the Stalingrad, or where these guys couldn't go anywhere, where they were basically lining up dead bodies, and you had lice and whatnot, like leaving dead bodies, going to the live people and everything else. That's grim, and that's grimmer than I think many of us are living in. But if you think of like New York, where they were piling up all of these bodies in regards to funeral places, or in Brazil, where it looks like they're building a large morgue right now. It's not entirely like a war, but you could say the economic and or at the very least health consequences are similar in regards to the number of people that we have dying. That's not a great answer, and our guest answer is far better than mine.
These are tough questions. Our question and answer part, not easy ones. John Pfeffer, you freaked me out a little bit because in one of your articles you had referenced how this moment could turn in quickly to the road, dystopian future where we're all just walking down roads looking for shelter and food. So that freaked me out, and that's what I had to sleep on last night. So thank you for that. We do have a caller on the line who wants to get in on our initial question there. What historical moment are you most thinking about during COVID-19? I believe Eric is on the line. Eric, are you here?
Yes, hi. I just want to opine that this coronavirus hydrochloroquine conversation on the mainstream media reminds me of back in World War II, the idea for the two-front war, which was the Americans were fighting the Japanese in the Pacific Ocean, but people in Europe and in Russia were saying, oh, we need two fronts. So from the west and the east, ergo the invasion of the French beaches and the meeting point, the end of the war. But like the American press at the time is sort of like egg on we should be fighting a two-front war, mainly the Pacific Ocean front and the attacks on Germany to ultimately end the war. I want to fathom what the American press was saying to the citizenry in the United States about against the idea of the two-front war.
Yeah, very interesting, Eric. Thank you so much for the call and your historical reference to COVID-19. Share with us any of your thoughts on any of the questions we have, 202-521-1320. John Pfeffer, we turn now to our next question here. This one's a little trickier, and you got to use your imagination, so we'll see if you got anything. But you are an author. Your latest book, Frostlands, is out, so people can check that out. So if anybody has a creativity and brain power to come up with the answer here, what book, movie, or play will most likely be written coming out of COVID-19 pandemic? We have our great radio engineer, Dimitri, had Tom Hanks starring in Casted Away. We also have Chris Cuomo starring in the sequel to the 1990 blockbuster starring Bill Cosby, Ghost Dad. But in this follow-up sequel, Cuomo will star in the movie alongside his father, Mario Cuomo, in the sequel called Ghost Padre. That's the best I had, John Pfeffer. I hope they got some laughs there. You got anything coming out with us inspired by COVID-19?
Okay, well, I mean, I'm doing the third volume of my trilogy, and it's going to be somewhat inspired by COVID-19, but that's not fair. I'm not going to simply advertise myself. So here's a movie or a book that I think, but possibly a movie, and it'll be called Touchless. It'll be a love story in which, because that's what we're heading into, unfortunately, is less of a touchy-feely kind of. We're going to have touch-free economy. We're going to have touch-free communication, and so I'm sure that there are going to be romances written in which people fall in love, but they cannot touch each other.
Interesting.
Jamal Thomas.
So
I'm curious, Jamal Thomas, you got anything?
I think I have the winning. Answer. A book called, or a movie, Frostlands, a society frozen in place due to a viral pandemic.
There you go. Stealing the headline there, the book title of John Pfeffer's book.
Exactly.
Also,
exactly.
Yeah. Good artists come up with their own stuff. Great artists steal. So maybe you're onto something, Jamal. Runners up, maybe a follow up to the movie Idiocracy called Even Dumber could possibly also be a great movie following Donald Trump's latest comments. Let's turn here to round 2, titled Global Politics for a Global Pandemic. John Pfeffer, we're going to get a little bit darker here on Question Team, but here on Political Misfits, we're letting them all out. The first question of round 2, John, what country or U.S. state is most likely to see the most disruptions in their electoral processes over the next year? This question is brought to us by our domestic sponsors, the states of New York, Wisconsin, and Georgia. New York and Wisconsin obviously had rocky roads in their efforts to hold elections over the last few months. And after a very controversial ruling last week, Georgia went on to cancel their election to fill a vacated state Supreme Court seat yesterday. The election was to be held on Tuesday, but after a 6-2 ruling by the Supreme Court, Georgia Governor Brian Kemp will now be allowed to handpick the person to fill the court. John, home or abroad, what country or states will see the most disruptions to their electoral processes under the calling of COVID-19?
Well, I do think that we will see some kind of disruption or more disruption here in the United States, but I guess I would choose Brazil, simply because led by someone who, Bolsonaro, who's possibly even crazier, Donald Trump, although it's a toss-up, and because the level of discontent with Bolsonaro is off the charts. So I'm expecting some kind of a confrontation between the growing hordes of folks in Brazil who support impeaching this guy and Bolsonaro's preference for a military solution. He's on several occasions said he'd like to see the military take over again in Brazil. So I think we're going to see a pretty major political disruption place in Brazil over the next year.
Jamal Thomas.
I'm thinking, believe it or not, I think there may be somewhat of a disruption in the United States. Like, when you were reading all of those polling, and one of the things that was clear is that the public doesn't believe that the government is doing what it wants. You have 70% that says we need to stay at home. By the same token, if you're staying at home, how are you paying for these items? Where's the disruption in regards to your ability to pay for X or to pay for Y? Now, we had Occupy Wall Street beforehand. We have the military or people backing up, boosting up. We did the story the other day where they were putting all of this money into military personnel, nonviolent protest means, and all of these other things in order to put down protests. I think they're expecting pushback in regards to these policies. And I think some of the money that these guys are investing in either police or either in equipment has to do with this expectation that something is going to pop off in the United States. I could be wrong, but I don't think they would be putting money in it for no reason.
Yeah. John, I wanted to ask you about Hungary a little bit. I thought that could have been a possible answer there. At the end of March, basically Viktor Orban was able to win legislation that was allowing him to rule by decree no elections can be held, and Orban's government will be able to suspend the enforcement of certain laws. What's going on in Hungary right now in regards to this question?
expect there to be any disruption. Unfortunately, I'd love to see some disruption. I'd love to see people basically rise up against Orban and put him out of office. But unfortunately, even before he passed a new enabling act, as it's called, he had a majority in parliament for his Fidesz, and the only kind of viable opposition was from further to the right, or probably moved into the center, even as Fidesz has moved further to the right. So I expect that Orban will simply, rule by decree where necessary. So, for instance, just recently, Hungary has basically banned transgender citizens. They are deprived of their citizenship rights if they insist on changing their gender or their sex. But otherwise, he'll simply move forward with usual electoral processes because he's confident that he can maintain his parliamentary majority.
Yeah, and Jamal, I mean, back to the point here, voting in the United States, it's interesting seeing some people post basically saying like, wait, we can go to grocery stores and to the dry cleaners, but we can't go vote in person. People desperately wanting to vote in person is something that they cherish very deeply in their democratic processes. And then at the same time, then you're pushing to have mail-in ballots, but we do know that mail-in ballots take a while to get right, to get where people's homes are. It would be really interesting to see if there was some type of political crisis here in the United States. If I understand the Constitution properly, Donald Trump's not able to unilaterally change the presidential elections. That's an act of Congress that would need to do that. So there's no rule by decree option for Trump, even though I'm sure the Republicans are looking into it. But it just seems like the mechanisms of actually going and voting may be what throws a lot of them off. And that can be driven more by just the populace than by politicians.
I find it interesting. I mean, we should have as many people voting as possible. But with all of the hysteria around voting that Republicans have put around voting, saying, they're trying to steal the vote total and everything else. The moment that you say, okay, well, we're going to have mail-in voting, well, you can have mail-in voting that's relatively safe, but the whole question becomes transparency in the process, which these guys outwardly attack. Part of the reason they attack it is because more people that vote, the worse chance Republicans have of getting in office. And so they are just diametrically against this notion of sending these things to everybody. People want to go to the polls almost out of habituation. But those people need to realize and understand that things intrude upon your real world. That means that you need to accommodate the fact that those things intrude upon your real world. The voting process is a process. It's not entirely real. It doesn't have to be done in explicit ways. You can find ways to do it. It just needs to be safe and accurate. And so some of these people are in such an ideology that the notion that this stuff is not necessarily real, it can be done in different ways, doesn't necessarily seem to factor into their thinking. It's strange. It really is.
Yeah. John Pfeffer, back to the game here in round two. The next question, which world leader would you call to gain more insights into how to handle a global pandemic?
Interesting.
So I guess I would call up Jacinda Ardern, Prime Minister of New Zealand. I think she's done an extraordinary job in New Zealand. And obviously, I mean, a lot of people know about the situation there, but briefly, they've number of infections down to 1,500, that's only 21. But also, the burden has not fallen predominantly on that's another important element of the situation in New Zealand. But I'd also say that did earlier, a year ago, with her response to the Christchurch killings, our right-wing white supremacist who opened fire in 2 mosques in the city of Christchurch. And her response, I think, was really a model for other countries. And also her not just to focus on kind of right-wing extremism within the country, but right-wing extremism globally with her Christchurch call. So I think she thinks globally. She is a resolute leader, and I think she would have some great on how to address this globally.
If I'm not mistaken, she also made this note about capitalism, right? I mean, was she the one that made the comment that capitalism has been a problem in our society, in our world, something to that effect? I'm paraphrasing.
Maybe. I'm not sure about that. I mean,
I could be wrong.
But putting out new guidelines there around ecotourism and tourism in the country, talking about shorter work weeks, more worker protections, she has been vocal for. John Pfeffer, I think that's a great answer. We actually had a guest interviewee for the game here that we actually asked the same question to back in June of 2019. I didn't ask it. Chuck Todd asked it, unfortunately, at the Democratic debate. Let's play this clip. Marianne Williamson guest starring here in Question Team. Here was her answer to the same question of who she would call if she was president.
And Ms. Williamson,
my
with the
first
last
call
word.
is to Prime Minister of New Zealand, who said that her goal is to make New Zealand the place where it's the best place in the world for a child to grow up. And I will tell her girlfriend you were so on, because the United States of America is going to be the best place in the world for a child to grow up.
Well, we would have to learn quite a bit how to end this pandemic, like New Zealand is doing a much better job of, John Pfeffer, for that to be true. But I just miss Marianne Williamson so much, and people laughed at the idea of calling Jacinda Ardern. And as you mentioned, she's doing a lot of things right now, so not so wacky and crazy, all of you out there making fun of Marianne Williamson. Jamal, anybody you're calling there on how to best handle a pandemic after what you've seen the last few months?
So I was going to pick New Zealand also. I mean, I've been following the stuff that she's been saying over the course of the last, let's say, month or so, and New Zealand's numbers have basically dwindled. I mean, they're going to be opening the economy back soon. Maybe, and this is, maybe two others. I would say Sanders, believe it or not, because I do think Sanders has a domestic focus. He's not in power outside of being a senator. But if he was in power, I think his focus would be on the public, and I think he would have somewhat of a global idea of trying to deal and stem the tide of it. But also, Germany hasn't been doing horrible things either. Germany, one of the things they've been able to do was basically put money into the hands of various businesses and corporations in order to keep their staff on. And so instead of having unemployment that goes to 20-something%, I think their unemployment is like at 3 or 4%. They've cut hours, they've given additional vacation time, but ultimately they've kept these businesses employed and they've kept the workers employed. So if it's this kind of trying to find a middle ground between the two, maybe some part of what Germany is doing, at the very least some of the policies. But yeah, I think I would have picked New Zealand off the top of my head. I mean, that was my choice.
Yeah. I'm going to give an honorable mention there to Miguel Diaz-Canel, there, the president of Cuba, and Cuba sending doctors around the world to basically be able to help out the rest of the world, despite our continued blockade of the island. John Pfeffer, we kind of alluded to it earlier, who you're not calling, but let me ask you, are there any world leaders that you would absolutely not call, or maybe you would call to learn what not to do in the time of a pandemic?
Well, I mean, the absolute worst has to be Trump. I mean, there are a lot of candidates out there, and certainly Bolsonaro's up there, Orban is up, but Putin even, frankly, is up there in terms of mishandling this. But Trump is at the bottom. I mean, it is beyond comprehension how poorly he has handled this at an administrative level. And remember, this is a guy who said he was going to bring all of his business experience to government. Someone who prides himself on, administering to a very large corporate empire, and even at the basic level of competence in terms of ensuring that supplies go to states, ensuring that there's open lines of communication, that there's proper information going out there. He hasn't even the experts front and forward to reassure the American public. I mean, it is a performance that I think will go down in history as perhaps the most visible, most corrupt, most ill-informed, and the most ill-prepared performance in a crisis, certainly in U.S. history, but there maybe even in modern world history.
All right, Jamarl Thomas, who are you not calling over the next to learn more about how not to handle? Who are you calling to learn how not to handle a pandemic?
Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro is horrible. I mean, Donald Trump is massively corrupt, and because he's so corrupt, this is a cash grab. I mean, basically the place is on fire and he's grabbing the jewelry and the money and basically giving it to his cronies. So I agree that Trump is atrocious, but Bolsonaro is insane. I mean, like he has basically been running against, getting the guy locked up. That's the first point. Getting Lula locked up. But beyond that point, in the way that he's handled this, he's pretended as if just science didn't exist. And, that has been showing in the devastation that has been taking place in regards to Brazil. Brazil is going to be a major hotspot, and that's entirely due to Bolsonaro himself. So Bolsonaro would be the guy that I would call to figure out how not to handle a crisis.
I'm just going to throw in for honorable mention. I think your answers are better, but Boris Johnson. I mean, the guy was in critical care at the hospital. He got the virus himself. Round 3 here of Question Teen. It's titled, Please, Please Let Me Back Outside. John, let's start with the economy. Over the next year, 2021, what will be the economic headlines most frequently revolved around? Is it A, unemployment numbers never rebound? Is it B, the global shock doctrine and austerity? Or C, workers strike back?
Oh, well, there's what I'd like to see and what I expect. What I'd like to see is workers strike back. I was doing my column this week, and I came across a bit of information that I had missed somehow, and I'm embarrassed. But at the end of December, Vietnam actually acknowledged its first independent trade union, and I thought, wow, that's amazing. And there have been a number of wildcat strikes there, and that's, of course, before pandemic, and Vietnam's actually handled it well. I expect that there will be considerable labor, but that's more perhaps on the hopeful side. What I expect, unfortunately, is the global shock doctrine and austerity, because that's what comes after enormous stimulus packages. You get a kind of, unfortunately, a pendulum swing in the economists who have been shunted to one side because their previous recommendations sucked, are then back in to helm the economy once the pandemic recedes, and they have effectively one solution, and that solution is austerity.
Yeah, I mean, Jamarl Thomas, we had the Washington, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser put out her budget over the last few days, and basically she was very, very proud that there would be no new taxes raised. We were going to dip into the coffers of the D.C. government and make big cuts, like $16 million cuts from the housing production trust fund. So no more affordable housing, no more money in savings. But luckily for all of us, no new taxes. Jamarl, what is the economic headline 2021 going to look like the most? Unemployment numbers never rebound, the global shock doctrine and austerity, or C, workers strike back?
Unemployment numbers don't rebound. I mean, they say 42% of the jobs aren't coming back. And so that's a level of devastation that is unimaginable. I mean, how do you keep up with those numbers? But the shock doctrine, I think, goes in tandem with that. I don't think those things are mutually exclusive. I mean, the devastation itself allows for corporations like Amazon or Walmart or these bigger corporations to have the ability to pass or send items to people's houses to basically supplant any of the private businesses that basically went under. So Amazon is going to be major. Jeff Bezos is going to be a trillionaire by 2026. I think they're intrinsically linked. I don't think it's one or the other. Unfortunately, I don't think it's the latter.
I'm going to have to I'm docking you a point there, Jamarl, for criticizing my question. Let the rules be noted there. Here in Question Teen, I have the powers to do that. Yeah, I unfortunately agree with both of you. I am going to say, hopefully, if the pandemic is lifted, if people feel better about coming out together, that we're going to see large economic strikes, something akin to the Occupy Wall Street movement. And I'm kind of with you there, John Pfeffer, hoping that my hope comes true more than maybe what I really think is going to happen. We have time for one last question here. John, the last question here. Donald Trump's approval rating right now, according to 538's aggregation of polls on this question, have Donald Trump's approval rating at 43%, with 52% of people disapproving. On October 3rd, 2020, 1 month before the November election, what will Donald Trump's approval rating be?
I think it's going to be pretty much the same. I mean, there's going to be fluctuation between now and then. Fluctuation and irrational exuberance around the stock market. His core of supporters are to stay with him, come what may. 52%, of course, is not going to be enough to win him the election. were to translate into actual votes. But there will be people who disapprove of him and vote for him anyway, or lie about whether they approve or disapprove. And so I think, like before, he'll use the popular vote. Electoral college will be close.
Jamal Thomas, Emmanuel Macron has dipped below 40% approval rating there in France. Donald Trump at 43%. Do you think he'll succumb to the same fate as Macron there and dip below 40%? Or what's your prediction for his October 3rd approval ratings?
October 3rd approval, just before the election. Oh, that's a tough one. I'm going to say his rating stays rather solid. I mean, despite the number of people that are dying, the disproportionate number of people aren't in his base. Even though a large number of people are. I would add a caveat, though, and say that if a large number of people in a heartland, if we get to 300,000 deaths, he may take a hit because those things will be directly affecting his own base also. But I agree with my guest. I agree with John. I don't think it changes.
Wow, two boring answers. Nothing changes. Where's the excitement in that, guys? I'm going to go on record. I'm going to say it's going to be at 39% on October 3rd. Once again, more wishful and hopeful thinking maybe than what might be the reality.
Wait, by the way, what was George Bush's approval rating before going into the election with Kerry, or for that matter, at the end? He ended up at like 30%, right?
John Pfeffer, do you have a number on the top of your head?
I do not. I remember thinking I was convinced he would lose.
He was low. Yeah, I mean, like at the end of it, not after. I mean, he beat Kerry, but after Kerry, when he was running and Obama was coming in office and that type of stuff, Bush's approval rating had hit the skids big time, like extremely low. And so
yeah,
I guess there's room.
I got 30 in February of 2008. It had Bush's approval rating standing at 33%. Wow. So there is plenty of room to move. And it's just amazing the political times that Donald Trump is somehow well above where George W. Bush was. Wow. Who would have thought? Well, we're out of time for question team. John Pfeffer, I'm going to announce you the winner. I had the final tally. John Pfeffer 4, Jamal Thomas 3, and I had 1 point here. Jamal Thomas, if you didn't criticize my question, you would have been in a tie there for first place, but that's what you get. John Pfeffer, you are the winner. Your prizes will be sent through the mail via the United States Postal Service. We're doing everything we can to lift up USPS. John, thank you so much for playing and being with us. Give us a little bit more about the work you do. Tell us where people can find you across the internet and about your book, Frostlands.
Sure. So I'm the director of Foreign Policy and Focus at the Institute for Policy Studies here in Washington, D.C. And you can find out more about FPIF at our website, fpif.org. If you want to see my articles, you can go to my website, which is johnpfeffer.com. My Splinterlands trilogy, which is Splinterlands, Frostlands, and the soon-to-be-released Songlands, is available at a variety of different locations. And I'll also be publishing a book on the rise of the global far right with Pluto Press that'll come out sometime next year.
As I mentioned, one of the most prolific people I know. John Pfeffer, thank you again for joining us. With that, we turn to a quick break. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik live in D.C. We're back after this.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today? Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I am here with my co-host, Bob Schlehuber. You guys hear that change in sound. It is Wednesday. This is one of my favorite segments, Revelations. Now, usually we're talking about UFOs. We're indulging in my fascination of that particular topic. But today, my other fascination, theoretical physics, is on the agenda. Now, there's a fascinating story that Bob brought to my attention that is bubbling up into the media. Basically, scientists have found evidence, experimental evidence, of an alternate reality that is close to our own, or alternate universe that is close to our own, that is traveling backwards in time in comparison to our own. Now, before you say, well, wait a minute, how is it traveling backwards in time? The key thing that you need to realize is that time and physics experiments, they aren't going any direction. I mean, the arrow of time is somewhat of an odd physics thing in and of itself because it can go backwards or forwards. It doesn't necessarily matter in regards to the experiments that you do in physics. It was also hypothesized going back to the 50s that there were alternate realities. But this is the first, as far as I know or I'm aware of having experimental evidence attesting to such. Basically, just to explain the experiment before delving into it, it's utterly fascinating. So they raised an antenna above the Antarctic. Now, they raised it above the Antarctic using a balloon because they wanted to get a large amount of space that it can cover. And they wanted to ensure that particles weren't coming from Earth and that the only particles that they were able to receive were the cosmic rays coming from space. Basically, think of cosmic winds. Earth is bombarded with particles constantly. These are some weakly interacting particles like neutrinos, and some of these are higher particles that get blocked out by our own magnetic field in regards to Earth, the magnetosphere, I think it's called, or our atmosphere. So the experiment pushed the balloon and the antenna up above Earth, so the idea that particles from Earth would not interrupt and it could get the cosmic rays. What they found, though, was that particles were coming from Earth and were interacting with the experiment. Now, neutrinos are weakly interacting particles that basically pass through us. Billions, right now, as you listen to me, are passing through you. They go through Earth all the time. Oftentimes, these things don't interact with matter in any real terms. Every so often they may interact, but they're weakly interacting. There are other heavier particles that do interact with matter, especially reassuringly, quote unquote, strong matter or dense matter. Now, as they put this thing in space, what they were finding were particles that were coming from Earth into the detector. Now, this shouldn't happen. This shouldn't happen at all. Now, what they were finding was a tau neutrino particle, which is a heavier neutrino. Now, they postulated that one or two things are true that they can think of. Either this particle changed into a heavier particle and then hit the detector, something that shouldn't happen, or that it's picking up a particle outside the context of our time frame, meaning an alternate reality. Now, that is awesome. The hypothesis of this is fascinating because this gets into the weird physics stuff. Think of the Spock with the beard for the moment. You know, the Spock from an alternate reality with the beard, or the Cisco, the dark Cisco. Like all of these characters, all of a sudden, every sci-fi drama that you have with some kind of alternate reality now come back into the forefront. Time doesn't have to go in any particular direction. And the physics of that particular universe are clearly unknown. This is just kind of an experimental evidence that they believe attest to, or at the very least point to, the idea of alternate worlds. Fascinating! So let me just read this. So scientists mounted a detector on a balloon and floated it above Antarctica to survey more than 1 million square kilometers of ice for signals from cosmic rays, NASA's Antarctic Impulsive Transient Antenna, which uses a giant balloon to basically lift it high up into the atmosphere. The cold, dry air from the Arctic prevents interference from Earth while allowing a constant, quote-unquote, wind of high-energy particles coming from outer space. Now, neutrinos are low-energy particles that weakly interact with matter and can pass through solid objects, including Earth. And like I said, as we speak, billions are basically ramming through us. We don't perceive them, and most of the time, they don't interact with pretty much anything. The interesting question is, if they don't interact, how do you know that they're there? And if they have any mass at all, how are they passing through solid objects? All these questions are fascinating. Raising the balloon above the Arctic means that high energy particles can only be detected coming down, quote unquote, there's no up and down, but from our perspective, down from space. To detect a heavier particle coming from Earth shouldn't happen at all. And yet, that's what took place. Now, the heavier particle, a tau neutrino, was found coming, quote-unquote, up from Earth and hitting the detector. Now, pointing out the ensured possibility of the tau neutrino's behavior, Gorham suggests, this was one of the scientists, suggests that the only way it could happen is if the particle changed into a different type of particle before passing through the Earth and then back again, 1 billion to 1 shot that it would happen even once, but this was something that they discovered multiple times. The other scenario is that basically an alternate world. The simplest suggestion is that the Big Bang created multiple universes, ours and another one in which time is running in reverse. Of course, if the inhabitants of this universe were able to perceive our own universe, they would think we were running backwards, and they would be just as fascinated as we were. It's relative. There's no one that is the right one or the other one. It's only relative. I guess the point here is that the most elegant explanation is not so much that the tau changed shape and became heavier before hitting the detector. The most straightforward or elegant explanation, at least at this point that they can think of, is that there is an alternate parallel universe beside us in which time is running backwards. Oh, this is fascinating. This team may have just discovered alternate universes. Bob, are you building a device in order to get to that universe to see what's going on over that device? Or better yet, if you could build a ship that would allow you to get to that universe, but it would only be a one-way trip, would you go?
Yeah, I'm still trying to understand the story. I really hope my future self understands it, or my parallel universe self understands it, or my past self understands it.
Well, think of it this way.
Just think, no, I mean, okay. I get the gist of it, Jamal. Okay. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to take a one-way ticket. That terrifies me, and I guess maybe that shows my lack of adventurism a little bit there to this alternate universe. Yeah, it's quite fascinating. We have DJ on the line. Let me wrap my head around it a little bit more and get DJ's comments on what he just heard. DJ, thanks to calling back in. We always love hearing from you. What are you thinking so far?
I think that's insane. I never even heard of a neutrino. Like when you start saying neutrino, I'm thinking neutron star or whatever. But just based off of what we can observe, you said something really interesting, that time does not have to flow in any one particular direction, even though that's the experience that we may have with time. It's not unreasonable to believe that time can flow in an opposite direction, because like everything in existence that we can observe, it's defined by some sort of opposite. So if one thing is true, on the other end of the spectrum, the other thing has to be true. So we may not see someone, go backwards you're not going to see an old person become a baby.
Well, that's what DJ, let me ask Jamar real quick. Hang on with us, DJ, for a second. I mean, is it Benjamin Button style where old people become young, grass degrows, trees degrow and become small seedlings again? I mean, are things working backwards? Because that's kind of what it feels like, but that just seems like our perspective when it comes to our biases towards time moving forward.
Yeah, those are our biases towards time moving forward. I mean, if you were in a completely different universe, you would behave and you would just think differently, because your world, your reality would just be governed by the laws of that universe. I mean, if Planck constant was different. Planck constant is the smallest value in the universe. Or let's say the speed of light was different. Let's say the speed of light was a different value. Then you may have a situation where life wouldn't be able to form, at the very least in the way we perceive it in this universe. Meaning, if you change any of the values, any of the constants in our universe, our perception and our ability to live in this world basically could potentially end. But you may have something else that can live. Like, we perceive time in a very specific way, but if you're looking at physics experiments and you're trying to work out some equation where time is a part of the equation, whether time is moving forwards or backwards doesn't matter. It doesn't factor into it. And so it is weird for us, but it wouldn't be weird for whatever is living in that alternate world. It would be just normal to them.
DJ, does that make any more sense to you? I'm still obviously going to have to go back and reread this article, but finish your thought there as I interrupted you.
No, I like how what you're saying. I do. I just think that, first of all, I don't think that there's anything that's true. Everything is just a matter of perspective, right? You could look at something and it's kind of, oh crap. I'm sorry, because there's time. I hope that you can open up your call line on your show, because I would love to talk about this and form a better kind of
Well, DJ, we'll let you go for now, DJ. We have plenty of time to talk more. You get that tomorrow time, but you always can shoot us a message at Sputnik Misfits or give us a call tomorrow. We always love hearing from all of you. 202-521-1320. I guess two questions, Jamal. I mean, is it kind of like if I walked into my bedroom and everything was shifted 1 inch to the left, where everything would kind of feel the same, but something would just kind of feel different? And then I'll ask you the same question. Are you getting on that one-way trip to the parallel universe that we're talking about?
So I don't know. It would be more drastic than that. Like, light moves, let's say, 9.8 meters per second square gravity from the standpoint of Earth. Imagine if it wasn't 9.8 meters per second. Wait a minute, I'm maybe saying that wrong. I'm thinking of acceleration. Think of a constant of the universe, be it the speed of light, which we consider to be a constant. Think of Planck constant, the length. Think of energy in regards to atoms like electrons and those type of things. If those things were altered and changed, life in the way that we know life might not be able to create formed in the universe. Like, it would drastically change. It wouldn't just be something a shift over. It would be a drastic difference in regards to those constants being shifted. I mean, you can make an argument that the only reason that this universe has been able to create it is because it allows the constants in the way that the constants were. It's a mathematical universe. It's part and parcel to the reason that people make this argument about our world being digital or in some degree virtual as opposed to a constant. Like, for example, when you do a double slit experiment, the double slit experiment basically takes a particle, sends it to two slits. And if you send it to two slits and you have a detector on the slits and you're looking at the value, meaning which one it goes through, then it gives you a value. It gives you a particle that goes through and you see from one side or the other where it goes. Now, if you don't, however, meaning if you don't put a detector on that slit, you get a wave. Now, this goes into this notion of particle wave duality where people are like, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. I'm sending a tennis ball through two slits. It has to go through one slit or the other, but in reality, it goes through both. It only goes through both, however, if you don't look. The moment that you look, it goes through one or the other. It chooses. In a material world, that shouldn't happen. And yet, that physics experiment has been done for the last 40, 50 years and has always come back regardless of how they do it. Even if they try to look at it where they look at it after the fact. Well, it looks like there's a back in time factor in this that you just can't know which one of those slits it goes through without taking the peek. And the moment that you take a peek, you get a different result. This goes to this whole idea of consciousness influencing our universe. Does your house exist if nobody's looking at your house? Based on that experiment, no, it doesn't. It takes an observer in order to make that stuff real and legit and tangible in our reality. This gets to this notion that this is not a material world, it's virtual.
Yeah. So Jamar, then let me ask you the obvious question as we have a minute or two left here in our weekly Revelation segment every Wednesday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern time. These flying UFOs that we're seeing do things that aren't understandable to the physics we have. There's got to be a connection between the two. Am I wrong?
That's the fascinating part. Like, people have argued or hypothesized that what we're seeing is something intruding into our dimensional space. We have no idea. Like, it's very possible that if you're talking about the world being virtual, well, you can have billions of those virtual worlds. I mean, what they're calling the Big Bang could have just been a computer system cutting on, in which case all of this, all of the systems went out and, creating energy and matter and all of this other stuff. From our perspective, from a larger perspective, it may not necessarily be what we consider it to be. I guess I'm saying it's difficult to know. I mean, you can have a civilization that is on some other part of the galaxy. They could even be in our galaxy for that matter. We just can't perceive them. That are using physics based on our own physics, meaning based on the things that are possible. For example, if you were living back in the 1500s, would you have conceived that it was possible to have a cell phone or to have telecommunications that could go across the world using just a little handheld device? And if those people in the 1500s got their hands on that device, could they, using their technology, figure out how that device works? It would just seem like magic to them. So you could, within the confines of our own reality, in the confines of what's possible in our own reality, come up with things that seem like magic. Things regarding consciousness. What about creating a device that can send your thoughts to somebody else through some kind of electrical means?
Yeah.
All of this stuff becomes possible. The problem is, until we get to a level of our understanding of our world, our physics, of our environment, of our space, that becomes difficult to do. And I strongly consider, just like we were with Newtonian physics, where we got part of it right, meaning if you weren't going at relativistic speeds, Newtonian physics works perfectly. The moment you go at relativistic speeds, Newtonian physics kind of falls away. It's possible that we are not entirely getting it all right. In fact, I would say most likely we're not getting it all right. And the closer that we get to better truth, the better our physics and our understanding of the stuff will be.
Yeah, I'll just make one correction of what you said, or add one thing you said there. You said on our planet. I'm big on the Middle Earther theory there, Jamal. They could be inside of our planet. We don't know yet. Maybe that'll be next week's
fair enough.
Revelation. That was all the time we have for our weekly Revelation segment. And man, did time go fast. It seemed faster than normal.
It's a fascinating segment. It's just so fascinating.
Let's take one final break here before wrapping up the show for the day, Jamal. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik Live in D.C. We're back after this.
Important hour of the day. It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schlehuber here, sort of kind of still with Jamarl Thomas. Few more stories we just wanted to slide in at the end of the day here, making sure you don't miss anything here on Political Misfits. In case you were wondering how things were going, U.S. aside from the pandemic, well, in addition to murder hornets, which we've reported on, as well as tornadoes, we have dams failing now, Jamarl. After days of heavy rain, 2 dams in Michigan were breached yesterday, unleashing catastrophic floods through parts of the state. Wow. The Edenville Dam and the Sanford Dam, both about 140 miles from Detroit, failed yesterday afternoon and evening, causing 10,000 people in central Michigan to be evacuated to higher ground. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer addressed residents of the worst-hit county in a press release saying, quote, "If you have not evacuated the area, do so now and get somewhere safe. This is unlike anything we've seen in Midland County. If you have a family member or loved one who lives in another part of the state, go there now. If you don't, go to one of the shelters that have opened across the county." Of course, hastily set up shelters crowded with strangers, exactly where most people don't want to be in the midst of a health crisis. The state does say, though, however, they have masks that they'll issue to people and at the shelter. The 73-mile Tittabawassee River is expected to crest around 8 p.m. tonight at a level that absolutely smashes its previous high water level by like 5 feet, Jamarl. The previous high was about 33 feet back in 1986. It's already at 34 feet and still rising. The state's meteorologists are urging anyone who hasn't left the communities near the river to get the hell out. Click on Detroit notes that in 2018, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission revoked the license of the company that operated the Edenville Dam due to non-compliance issues that included spillway capacity and the inability to pass the most severe flood reasonably possible in the area. The Edenville Dam, which was built in 1924, was rated unsatisfactory condition in the 2018 by the state. The Sanford Dam, which was built in 1925, received a fair condition rating. Both dams are in the process of being sold. Jamarl, quite a terrifying end note there. Both dams are in the process of being sold. We're basically selling infrastructure that protects the public good to private corporations. Both of these dams, at least the one there in Edenville Dam, was rated quite poorly. It's conversations that, again, with the coronavirus, and kind of goes back to our full circle here on the media conversation. It seems like the media's sole focus, and obviously the bulk of our focus is on the coronavirus, but all of these other conversations, obviously the continued disaster from climate change, but the lack of proper infrastructure in this country is going to just compound any types of problems that we see with climate change. I mean, the house 2 doors down from me is being gutted and rebuilt right now, Jamal. And there was a big windstorm the other day, and they just had huge shingles, huge pieces of lumber basically blown in and across the yards throughout our neighborhood. And if it's these like strong daytime half-hour storms are disrupting huge building projects, it just seems like it's going to compound to even bigger problems like we're seeing now in Michigan.
Yeah, and my dad, deadbeat dad, used to work at a water facility place in Richmond, Virginia. And down Main Street or Broad Street, but when you get down near the City Hall and near part of Richmond, that's a flood zone. And so depending on how bad the rains are, that area would flood. I mean, you still have areas down there right now, businesses, where you can see the water line of stuff that took place, like years ago. And so I get how it can overwhelm the flooding or the precautions that people use for the flooding. This puts you in mind of PGE in California, right? That was supposed to be dealing with the electricity.
Yeah, PG&E.
Right, but they were trying to basically make a profit. And as they were trying to make a profit, they were basically not doing the things that was necessary in order to ensure that state had their material needs. Whether we realize it or not, we as human beings have things that we need. Material needs, whether it's clothing, whether it's a house, whether it's food, whether it's shelter. And companies take over these jobs not to supply those needs, but in order to make profit. The supplying the needs is a stupid human trick that they do in order to make the profit. There is a difference, though, in those things. This company that they basically, like you said, told, yeah, we are revoking your contract on. Well, the company is still doing the job. It's like, how are they doing the job if they were already revoked of the contract? Looks like you would either find another company or you as the state would take over the responsibility yourself. The mechanism and the materials are there. You just need to have people to man those facilities. I mean, come on. I mean, do the job, right? If you're going to do it.
Shout out to the documentaries you mentioned, PG&E, the great documentary, just horrific to watch, but it's called Fire in Paradise that looks at that 2018 Camp Fire and the malfeasance of PG&E. And they're not going to be held accountable one way or another, Jamal. I mean, they're filing bankruptcy. They're saying if we pay out people that the courts have ruled we're supposed to pay, then we're just never actually going to be able to get out of bankruptcy and then we'll never have any money. And the courts are kind of like, oh, well, that's a good point. You guys need money. So, like, let's just not have you pay anytime. It's like, wait, what is happening? And those people there, the 10,000 people that are going to see their homes destroyed because of these possible flooding, because people aren't fixing the infrastructure that they were tasked to fix, and there's no accountability or oversight. It's one thing to basically say this thing is bad, but if nobody then has to fix it, well, what does it matter that you had the accountability in the first place? Tomorrow, I just wanted to hit on a story we weren't able to get to yesterday here around tracking COVID-19 numbers. It turns out that earlier this month, the architect and manager of Florida's COVID-19 dashboard announced that she had been removed from her post. Florida Today reports that the dashboard had been praised by the White House for its accessibility and ease of use, and it's become a one-stop shop for researchers, the media, and the public. So why was this data manager sacked? The manager has implied that it was an act of retribution after she resisted hiding data from the public. The Tampa Bay Times reports that the tracker had shown data indicating Floridians were reporting symptoms of COVID-19 before cases were officially announced. Reporters requested that information, and shortly afterwards, officials told the data manager, Rebecca Jones, to remove that information from public view. She objected, but eventually complied with the order, though she told her supervisors it was the wrong call. Jamal, I mean, it seems like we're relying on individual acts of heroism for people to give up their jobs. I mean, FedEx workers, Amazon workers, these government employees, the only people that are willing to strike back and hold some truths up and hold people accountable are individuals in really heroic ways right now. But it's also terrifying that our government continues to try to suppress and oppress information from getting out there.
Yeah, it's disturbing. I mean, when you think of yourself as what's a rational government, when you think to yourself, what's a rational government? How would a rational government respond in this situation? But what you find out is that there are all of these like little micro incentives in the way that people act, either in trying to disclose information or hide information, in the way that governments are trying to focus on economic benefits as opposed to human health, in which case what she was putting out was not something that they wanted, and they needed her to get rid of that in order for them to kind of still push this narrative of everything is great, we're going to open up the economy. Yeah, you would hope, you would pray that you'd have a rational system, but that rational system requires accountability in regards to the way people go about their affairs. And unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be part of our political system.
No, unfortunately, it doesn't. And unfortunately, Jamar, we're at the end of our time here on Radio Sputnik for the day for Political Misfits on Wednesday, May 20th. A big shout out and thank you to our guests, John Pfeffer and Dr. Wilmer Leon. A big thank you to our radio engineers, Ryan, Dimitri, Andre, and Saul, and the entire Sputnik News team. Shout out to our producer, Michelle Whitty. On behalf of Jamal Thomas and myself, Bob Schlaber, thank you for listening. Now get back to organizing.
Guys, as always, thank you for joining us. Always appreciate it. Your engagement is always one of those things that helps the show. DJ, I'll try to have a call-in for one of these topics. You know, I use 420 segments where we get into this kind of weird and strange stuff, and I haven't did it for a while because we've been doing the Wednesday segments where I get to get my UFO bona fides out, or my UFO stuff out. But look, that story is fascinating. I mean, they would have to be corroborating experiments in order to give some legitimacy to it. And, you know, mainstream media has a tendency to kind of embellish. But if they were able to corroborate that, it would be utterly fascinating if they're able to find something like that. Now, the catch is, this can be one of those things where they're postulating, but they don't know because they don't know what they don't know. So think of it as, you hear people say God either doesn't care or God doesn't have the power to do anything. And that presupposes that God should do something. That presupposes that reality is set up in a particular way where the entire point is good and bad. And missing the point that good and bad are relative. And you may have things that go beyond just your basic notions or your societal ideas of good and bad. It pre-postulates something, even though it tries to make it as if it's limiting to two answers. It's not two. There's more. In this case, they don't know what they don't know. And so basically you have a situation where they're trying to postulate based on what they know or what they believe. And you get, up to this point, two ideas. Either that thing is changing into something else and then hitting the detector, or something else is going in the opposite direction regarding time and the universe is close to our own, where these weakly interacting particles are able to somehow cross over. It's fascinating. I mean, the back in time effect is also seen in a double slit experiment when they use, what is the name of it? It's a delayed reading or something. It's where they look at the results in a delayed fashion to see if it changes the result tally, where consciousness is influencing the experiments itself. This stuff is fascinating. And that mainstream, I mean, this goes back to like 50 years in physics. Charles Cavan, should Bernie face consequences for lack of action? The question is, what are those consequences? Like, consequences how? Basically, Sanders is nearly 80. I don't know how long he's going to be in Congress. I suppose he could be in for another 10 years. That would be astonishing. Look, whatever you want to think of Sanders, you have to give credit where credit is due. And, I think this is somewhat different than a Warren case or anything else. Sanders just didn't have it in him. But I don't necessarily think he was acting maliciously. It's possible. It's possible it was always a scam, that, it was always one of those things he was going to capitulate and give it over to Democrats. But did he think that he had the potential to win? And I do think at one point he did. But I don't know what those consequences are. We could talk about what those consequences are. All right, I'll end this here. Like, share,